L-A into the K, you would already know this song. What else? Really? No one else?
All I can really understand is take the power.
You weren't listening. Come on, somebody. Somebody's heard other lyrics.
Like no more lies.
Right? From who? You know? Who do you think he's talking about? They are talking
The
about.
authorities.
Right. What else did you hear? Monica.
It talks about the faults of the educational system, like teachers depositing lies into students' brains and stuff.
Right. We give this grandiose ideal of what America looks like in policy, and we try to get you to conform and behave well in society and listen to rules. Right. So, before I begin, I wanted to recognize my location in this lecture, which is that of a teacher, right? I have a slanted view already when I go to speak to you about what I'm about to speak to you about. Okay. I want to make sure that I recognize that and acknowledge that to you. Okay, in debate, that's called a social location argument. It's identifying who you are or where you come from. I grew up in this rather little conservative area in Ohio. Right? It's a kind of small town USA, as much as we like to think we're not. I was raised in a Catholic education system. Went to Catholic schools all of my life. I've worked in the Catholic education system for 14 years. And when I did work in a public system, that particular public school district isn't all that liberal either. So it's important to identify where you come from when you do a lecture like this, where you're talking about challenges to the state. I came here, obviously this is a state institution. The state pays for my bills. But I would like to think that I'm pretty well educated, being that I've got some college degrees, and I've been in the debate community for a long time, and I've read a lot of things. But it's important when you're dealing with these sorts of issues that you identify where you're from. If you all understand the importance of that. Some might think, right, if you've been raised in a Catholic institution your whole life, what do a lot of people think those kids do? Pray and sleep, right? I do pray. I do have great faith. It's important to identify. I don't necessarily have faith in the way my Catholic faith has outlined it for me. What else? You think about those kids from those Catholic backgrounds, Catholic schools, go to school every day.
A little intolerance for others.
Right, could be. Right, we get this idea. We're taught. The whole time we're brought up that we've got a good way of doing things. Now, I would like to think that we were taught, don't throw the first stone. But what else? How about people who leave that sort of Catholic institution or that very religious institution?
Like they're like ostracized from other Catholics that are still there. Like,
Well, I haven't been excommunicated, but that could happen, yeah.
well, not like it's
Might happen.
like they're not like people don't like want to participate as much necessarily.
Yeah, there are some people who are very firm in religion, right? And they like to stick with other people who are similar, that are like-minded, right? And if you're very liberal, do you enjoy spending a lot of time around someone who's very conservative? No, right? So I mean, that's a natural reaction of human beings. It's what we do. We tend to generate towards like-minded individuals. What else? Come on. Still haven't hit the one I want.
What are you looking for? Are you looking for how Catholic children react to the education system, how they behave in the classroom, what their
I don't know.
goals are?
What do you think about those things?
Well, they have there is a stereotype, okay, that they are, like he said, a little intolerant of other religions, but that they are more likely to be compliant and obey the teacher culture, because they've been around, you know, a
Right.
structure that.
Here, right, especially
Yeah.
Catholicism, we stand up, we sit down, certain times,
Right,
stand
right,
up,
right.
sit down.
So they're more likely to be compliant and not behavior problems. That is a stereotype.
Right.
I would say that.
What do you see sometimes with kids that are living a very strict upbringing and then they go to college?
Sometimes they go wild.
They go wild, right? Okay. And so they get these crazy ideas in their head. If you've ever asked my mom about me, she'd shake her head. Right? My mom is still very right-wing, conservative, and so to her, where has she gone wrong? She's got this liberal feminist daughter, and I've taught it to my brother. Right? So family dinner is really interesting, where it's two very different ends of the spectrum, right? Where we're to discussing politics, and there are times that we just agree to not discuss.
Have you ever watched Breaking Amish?
Yes.
Sort of an idea.
Yeah. All right, so it's important to recognize these things. So before I go into this, it's important for me to point out to you that, I've seen, I've lived, and I don't mind, to be quite frank, the way a strong religious upbringing works. I'm proud of it. As liberal as I am right now, I am proud of that upbringing. It taught me a lot of good things. Got a great education, and I learned a lot about how we should treat other people. But what I did with that information is what I did with it. So you're going to learn a lot of stuff, right? Just like the song was talking about the education system. What you choose to do with what you learn is up to you. I chose to do take what I learned and apply it to these larger concepts about how I think you should treat other people. All right, so let's talk about where some of these ideas and concepts came from. Now, I can talk for hours and hours about power relations. I was talking to Jackie about one this morning, telling her I think I was going to cut this or that. I want to focus on just three main authors, okay? And they might surprise you, the ones that I've chosen. But here they are. I'm going to start with Jeremy Bentham. This is him. Long hair. Jeremy Bentham. He came up with the concept of utilitarianism. This is an important concept for Lincoln Douglas debaters. This is also a very important concept for policy debaters. Right? Utilitarianism is sort of a starting point, if you will, on framework debates on the critique. But for LD debaters, you resolve this issue a lot. So this is why I decided to start here. Because it heavily influences my favorite power author that we'll get to at the end. So utilitarianism says that we should decide things by what is the greatest good for the greatest number. The greatest good for the greatest number. Utilitarians claim that the way to resolve government decisions, right, if there is a decision about what should be made, the way you decide that is to look at who it will benefit. If it benefits the most people, then you should do it. It also resolves questions of power. Who should get the power? Right? Their argument is it should be people who are working for the common good for the most number of people. Utilitarians believe that there should be government forces. Right? Because someone has to make these decisions. So Bentham lives from like the 1750s to the 1830s. I told you guys not big on dates. But what I want you to see is he's born in 1748. What's happening when he's roughly in his 20s? Right, there's a lot of political upheaval at the time that he is, a little bit younger than me, and roughly the same age as me, a ton of political unrest in the European system. You've got some battles with the French. You've got these pesky colonists in the U.S. who are trying to gain their independence. Okay. Bentham, actually, if you ever do some research, wrote a response, right? We sent the colonists sent papers to Great Britain with a list of what they wanted, right? Their declaration for their independence. And Bentham actually wrote a response and thought some of it was a little bit crazy. Okay. So it's odd that Bentham is sort of a founding thought for what led to U.S. principles. But he is. Okay, Bentham, to give you some background, he was a philosopher, he was a legal reformer, but what he really did is he was a jurist. So, in other words, back in the day, they would take smart people and they would be on juries and decide court decisions. So when he speaks, he is speaking about legal reform and government reform and how he thinks things should look. But understand, he kind of sees things in small niche groups. Right? He's a jurist who sees his community and how he influences the juris system and local government authority influences small niche societies. Now, what's interesting about Bentham is he was really ahead of the times. He supported women's rights. So you will find some things from Bentham advocating women's rights. He was believed in individual freedoms. He was against slavery. He did not believe in the death penalty. Interesting, right? What did I tell you his job was? Jurist. Yeah, he was a jurist. He didn't believe in the death penalty. He also believed that they should decriminalize homosexuality. And he believed in animal rights. Right. This is why we start with him, because look how far back we are. And he introduces some concepts that heavily influence modern power relation philosophies. He believed that to make the correct decisions, you had to have something governing you. So in other words, you had to decide, right, what was the greatest good for the greatest number, but something, you had to have a formula, if you will, for how that works. And his measure was pleasure versus pain. Pleasure versus pain. He said that people inherently prefer pleasure over pain. Some philosophers don't always agree with this. And he says that like happiness and pleasure or pain can be in two forms. It can be physical pain, right? You're hungry, something hurts on you, you're tired. Or it can be spiritual, right? You're sad, you're not thinking clearly. All right. So his idea was that government should evaluate the pleasure to pain ratio for its citizens, decide what would bring pleasure over pain to the majority of people. So the government was tasked with determining the pleasure versus pain ratio on a particular decision and choose the option that gave the most pleasure or happiness to the greatest number of people. He used this thing called hedonistic calculation for that. Use the hedonistic calculation, right? He tried to design a formula to assess pleasure versus pain. So it would literally be, we're making a decision, okay? There's happiness, there's sad. Okay. So let's talk about going to Kristie's lecture. you're assessing to go or not to go, right? Now, what would be a reason for why that would make you happy? Devin, what? Right, +1. Casey gets mad. Right, what else? What's another reason? Go ahead,
Learn interesting stuff.
right. You get smarter. What else? Christian. Right, she's always going to do something interesting and fun, right?
Good jokes.
She always has good jokes because she is in fact funny. Anything else?
You don't waste money.
Right. You spent good money on coming to listen to her speak. Hopefully you're not sitting there thinking, why did I pay good money to listen to Kristie Kramer speak? Awesome.
You see other people.
Right, you get to see your friends. All right, let's talk about some negatives.
You have to wake up early.
Right.
Yeah.
The weather.
I like bed. It's raining.
Well, wake up early should be -3.
No, everything gets assessed. Similar value. What else? What else? What else is a negative?
Chairs are hard.
What's that?
The chairs are hard.
The chairs. All right.
Preach.
Your butt hurts.
Yeah. After 2 hours, yeah.
Not enough plugs.
Not enough what?
Plugs.
We don't need them from this lecture, but I'll add it. Electricity.
I'd say
Okay? Yeah, you have to stay awake. Alright, so what he would say is we would add this up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So his assessment would be, like, I'm simplifying this a little bit, obviously, but his idea would be, I win! Right, you're coming to my lecture. So he would say that they can apply the same sort of formula, right, to government decisions.
It's like a cost-benefit analysis.
Yes, very much so. Right. But he's trying to make it so people should be a little more impartial, right? And so they apply this sort of formula. Okay? Everybody with me? You'll really understand now.
So I was chilling in my room today playing Mega Man when I saw this gummy bear lying on my floor. Now, I can't remember the last time I actually bought gummy bears, so how it got here is completely beyond me. But when life gives you gummy bears, you make gummy bear eggs. Except gummy bear eggs is probably really gross. So instead, I'm going to make lots of eggs. And what can you do with a gummy bear? I imagine you can eat it. But should you eat it? Is it morally right to eat it? Let's figure it out the way utilitarian works, with math. Well, it's candy, so it probably tastes kind of okay. It's also probably all linky and gross. Not really gross, but still kind of gross. So overall, it's not a great idea. Not a lot of moral value to be found here, and it's not really conducive to my assignment. So, now what? Suddenly, I hear the irritating sound of child's laughter.
It's ironic that I show you this.
My first thought is, hey, I just got hard knuckle. But my second thought is, hey, there's kids outside. But my third thought is, hard knuckle. But my fourth thought is, opportunity. What if I gave the gummy bear to one of the kids? That makes me a horrible person. Let's find out. We start off with the basic stuff. It's delicious, but it's also disgusting. But the kid doesn't know that it's disgusting. So it really doesn't him anything. Plus, I get the satisfaction of doing something nice. Plus, I get my project done. Plus, I get to look like a good neighbor in front of the girl whose house I accidentally broke into. So in the end, not only am I not a terrible person, I'm actually an American hero. Think it. Want to go there? Just like that, I get top score from around. Doing the right thing keeps good.
Hey, God, you should have gotten it.
All right.
I heard the annoying sound of
So-
children laughing.
Boys don't accept candy from
We're choosing the one who's playing with August?
Yes.
Alright
And then I got a work detail.
then. Beautiful. Alright, so you start to see that formula, right? It's a very simplistic form, but it's a good way for you to understand how it works. I don't really know what that video game was that they were playing, but
Yeah, man.
whatever. I figured you all would know something about it. So the idea is, right, that to make a decision, we sit down, we kind of evaluate things about, and we make our decisions based on what we think is moral on this pleasure-pain principle. There are some problems with the system. We'll talk about it in a moment. The other thing that Bentham's really popular for is the panopticon. Now, a lot of people, right, don't credit him with this. They end up crediting someone that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, falsely, because he didn't create the concept. As I told you, Bentham was a jurist, right? He was involved in the legal system, and so he spent a lot of time philosophizing and thinking about how things could be. And he started coming up with this concept called the panopticon. And to him, it could be any institution building, right? Any institution could use a panopticon. Okay? It becomes most famous because they try to apply it to a prison system. In an institution building, it's set up so that people can watch you at all times, right? I talked about this on the philosophy overview when you were all here. Me and the guard sits in the middle. All the inmates are here. This person may be insane. Okay? And so it's the idea that they don't know you can see them, right? This is all one-way mirrors. If you think you're being watched, what do you naturally do? You act better, right? You behave a certain way. So his idea was that you could do this anywhere. You could do it in a daycare, you could do it in a school. The people will make better decisions, right? Better conscious moral decisions, and they think someone's always watching them. They do this thing called self-regulate. Okay? The idea of self-regulation is really important. Self-regulation and panopticon are a basis for power relations. And so this is why we're talking about it. They will self-regulate. They don't want to be in trouble. If they think they may get shot, they're going to behave. They create a fear. They have a fear that they generate in themselves naturally. They have really no idea if the guard even has a gun. And in fact, this is such an effective system, Bentham says, that you could just leave it unmanned, unguarded. It could be that there's no one in there. No one would need to watch them. It was supposed to reduce the need for certain labor. Because just the fear is enough, right? The fear that you have to regulate is enough to get you to behave. He said it would allow you to obtain power over the mind. Right? It's the power of the mind over the mind. You are psyching yourself out. That's a classic example of how the mind controls the mind, right? Now, when he designs Panopticon, he says you can apply it to any institution. Most famously, he's trying to apply it to a prison. The Panopticon never happens. People try to claim things from Panopticon that is not true. The Panopticon, as he designed it, never actually happened. When they built a prison system, they used someone else's design. Now, I say that, and in a little bit I'm going to tell you the Panopticon did happen. Okay. The way he envisioned the Panopticon, his design did not happen at that time.
Isn't that what like CCTVs are?
What are?
Like security cameras?
Yes. It is a similar concept. We're going to talk about that. Alright. Besides this being a great example of self-regulation of the Panopticon, it's an example of knowledge and power. It's an example of knowledge and power. These are, and this is another important concept, right? Is that the idea that someone is watching you creates in you a certain knowledge that makes you act a certain way. So the knowledge that someone is watching you has power over you. Right? It forces you to act a certain way. Knowledge and power. Because you could do whatevs if you didn't think anyone was watching, right? I know that's true for some of you in this room. No one was watching you. You were just doing your own thing. No one was there. You would do whatevs. Like you wouldn't care. But the fact that there are people in there, people are watching you, changes what you do. Okay. We're going to talk about a student next. A little less hair. My husband will look like about 10 years.
That exact face.
All right. John Stuart Mill is a student of Bentham's. Right, he lives in the 1800s, so 1806 to 1873. There's still some things going on in the world. John Stuart Mill is also involved with government. He's a member of the English Parliament at the time. He was a civil servant. Bless you. So similar to Bentham, he's sort of seeing what the government's doing, right? There's a slight difference between the two of them. Mill takes Bentham's idea of utilitarianism and goes a little bit different route. But the difference, I think that part of the reason for this difference is because Bentham is a legal jurist, right? So he sees small communities. Where he is making these decisions. Whereas Mill, he's in the Parliament. Who's the Parliament in charge of? The entire nation, right? So he's seeing how the government's operating in a little bit larger scale, and he's part of that, right? So that influences the direction that he takes utilitarianism. He thinks that the utilitarian framework is probably a decent one. However, he's concerned about the loss of individual freedom in society by using this model. But look, he says, my teacher Bentham, I praise him, he's great. I had that because I have some of my own students. But I'm going to change his idea a little bit, because he says, here's the problem. You have this whole great big society, and if you're in small little sections of it, small groups are making decisions for individuals, but those groups are making decisions that bring them pleasure without considering the pain of those other individuals. Right? They're not as accountable to them. They're not being accountable to those individuals. Further, he says that model isn't necessarily intended for these sort of small groups that can exist, right? But rather, that model should be applied to a larger part of society, that you wouldn't use those same calculations for small groups, because it just wouldn't work there, right? If you have a group of 6 people, and 5 of them decide they don't like one, that justifies them beating the crap out of one, right? 5 of us decide that we don't like one of you, and we win this calculation, and we say it would make us happy to beat you up because you are annoying. That's great for the ones who aren't being beat. But for the one person who's being beat, that is pretty shit-tastic. So he says that this framework should be used sort of by governments on a larger scale when you're making large group decisions, but that this shouldn't necessarily apply to things like it's not okay for a large group to necessarily make decisions to kill an individual. As I said, he's concerned about individual freedom. He says this pleasure versus pain principle can be used by governments, but individuals should also be able to make it for themselves, right? That we as individuals should be able to determine what will bring us most pleasure versus pain. And as long as those decisions don't harm others, we should be able to make any decision we want. And so as long as those decisions don't harm others, we should be able to decide on this principle and make our decisions. Now, yes, we have individual freedom in that we can make these decisions. However, the harm to others is a focal point of his, right? If I decide to kill myself, it is only a harm to myself? Who else is it harm? Right, people I know. So that probably wouldn't be a good decision. If I decide I really want Xander's computer, to which you should not be on, you better be taking notes. If I take it, it gives me pleasure. Is that a harm to him? Right, so I shouldn't be doing it. Okay? Can we think of an example of a decision you make that wouldn't be a harm to others? Fun. Playing basketball? How could basketball harm anyone else?
I know this one. You could miss, the ball could bounce from something and hit someone right in the head.
Simpler than
That would be a, sort of a consequence of that decision. He wouldn't be quite as concerned about that, but there is something he might be concerned about.
the other guy
But they chose to enter into that competitive environment.
Continuous bouncing of the ball annoying everyone.
Yes, right? So how do you know that when you're bouncing the ball, there's not someone who's sleeping nearby?
The time trades off with something else. You do it
Right,
else.
like studying.
Yes, you could be doing something else with someone else. Right. Okay. So, while he's in favor of these individual freedoms, he says you can't harm other people. He comes up with this concept called social liberty. Social liberty as a result of kind of seeing how the way the world is and seeing the best way to apply utilitarianism. Social liberty says that we need rulers, that's what he said at the time, just think of the times that it was. So we need government, but that they have to have constraints. Right? So we still need government, but they have to have constraints. So when rulers make decisions, they can't be making decisions that just benefit themselves as rulers. Government leaders, understand I'm using the term ruler because I'm in the 1800s. They can't make decisions that just benefit themselves, but their decisions have to benefit society as a whole. They have to benefit society as a whole. He says, under the concept of social liberty, that even though we need a government, we need to have a check system. We need to have a check system that people can regulate their government and speak out. He was a huge advocate of free speech. Right? Because to him, to sit quietly is dangerous, and it could be a thought that we should hear, right? So, he says we should be able to regulate our government. By the way, he was anti-censorship as a result of this, right? He doesn't believe in censorship because he thinks people should be able to say what's on their mind, right? Because saying what's on your mind doesn't necessarily cause harm, right? It's the action that you take because of those words.
Yeah, he's free to
Sure. All right. He says that social liberty can be abused by the government, but that the most dangerous place for social liberty is in society. Right? He says social liberty also applies to society and social context. Because that's the most dangerous. Yes, governments make really big decisions. Right? Government penalties can be quite large. But those kind of decisions are rare and won't impact as many people. But that socially, it permeates, right? Social liberty, the way we make decisions, the way we should act, and smaller groups in society, socially, amongst ourselves, has much more impact. Right? It's far-reaching. And while those consequences might not be as large, it controls us better. There's not really a lot of government in play in this room, right? But we control, we self-regulate, we control one another, right? Some people would say this is far more dangerous right here than what Obama's doing. So I've got my hand on you. I'm teaching you something. You all are interacting. There becomes an expectation as to how you should act in society. Right? Understand that that's far more reaching than even what the government does. Does this make sense? This becomes the root of social context of power. It becomes one of the roots of social context of power. That in society, social groups, we do a better job of controlling one another. Right? It's more dangerous than even what government's doing. Especially if they're smart enough to apply pleasure versus pain principles. Now, two very different gentlemen.
Right, so first things first, there's two types of utilitarianism: active role. Anti-utilitarianism was the first form, put forward by Jerry Bentham, who looked something like this. Rule utilitarianism was proposed by student John Stuart
You'll see why I
Mill
think this is
7
funny,
years
because he has
later.
used similar
Mill
things.
sort of looks like Bentham, only with less hair and a thinner face. Just start with Bentham here. The first thing he really did was come with the rule: be greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This in turn became a bedrock for all his and other forms of utilitarianism. Bentham also said that we were ruled by two sovereign masters: pleasure, the good one, and pain, the bad one. It was by weighing up these 14 pleasures and 12 pains for each situation individually, you could decide if an action was morally right or wrong. To do this, each pleasure or pain was given a numeric value depending on how many people it affected and how long it lasted, amongst others. This system was called the hedonic calculus. This system, some also claim, led to the biggest problem with utilitarianism, because it allowed obviously immoral acts to take place. The classic example of this is the sadistic guard scenario. These guards get pleasure out of seeing a prisoner tortured, and as they outnumber the prisoner, this torture will probably be seen as a moral act by utilitarianism, despite the fact that it's obviously immoral to do, torturing another human. Despite these misgivings about utilitarianism, people seem to like him enough to preserve his body and lock him in a cupboard in University College London, letting out for banquets. Now,
It's literally his
on to
body.
J.S. Mill. A student of Bentham, he studied Bentham's work in utilitarianism, however he believed he could do better. This led him to use rule utilitarianism, which is something different to active utilitarianism. Mill claimed that pleasures were qualitative rather than quantitative. In other words, it is better to have fewer high-quality pleasures than many low-quality pleasures. He divided pleasures into two categories: pleasures of the mind, such as poetry and opera, and lower-quality pleasure of the body, like eating and sex. He summarizes very nicely in a phrase: it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. He also tried to solve a problem of sadistic guards. He argued that the pain and pleasures of only one man should not be considered, nor should the pain and pleasures of the people solely involved in the act. Rather, the pain and pleasures of the society as a whole should take precedence, and this will allow you to see whether society as a whole will benefit from the act, therefore deciding whether this act is morally right or wrong. Yet another production.
Wait, what did they do with his body?
They preserved it, and they put it in that like coffiny-looking thing, and it was sitting in a university. I'm not sure if it's still there or not. I think maybe just Burton's there now. I think that part of it came apart, so they only kept some parts of it. I'm pretty sure his head's still around. He wanted to be preserved and left in the university. Which university? University of London, I'm pretty sure.
What is that about a pig and a
What's the difference between a human and a pig?
Many.
Reason, right. And so, you could be a pig who just decides things based upon your pleasure, right? That this principle allows you to just decide anything based on pleasure that it gives you at that moment, right? A pig is fat, is happy, he's lying in the mud, it gives a pleasure, versus a human that shouldn't be the way we're making moral decisions based upon whatever makes us fat and happy at that moment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that this pleasure-pain principle, it's not as simple as Bentham tries to make it, that there are different characteristics which are acceptable for deciding pleasure versus pain. All right. We are now going to talk about my favorite person. Not my favorite person. You know anything about me? I know a lot about this philosophy. So we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about this. Skipping some others. Michel Foucault. He is a French philosopher. There are lots of other periods of history and philosophy. We're jumping down here because this becomes the basis of a lot of what Jackie is talking about. Okay? And there are some sort of sovereign questions of power that we're not going to get into as much today. People want to talk about this at some point. We can in a Casey chat session at some point. And I love talking about Giorgio Agamben, so I'm sad I'm leaving him out, so I'm going to give him a shout out right now. But I'm going to focus on Foucault. And the reason why I talked about Bentham and Mill before him is soon you will see, bless you, how he sort of builds upon their ideas. Michel Foucault was born in the 1920s. He passed away in 1984. He was a philosopher, a thinker. He didn't really like to be called a philosopher. A literary critic. So he wrote a lot of things. I think I own something like 10 volumes of his. He makes many different points. We're going to talk first about this concept of reason. Right, reason, that we can reason things out. That we're rational thinkers and we'll come to certain conclusions. He rejects that concept. Right? Because what is the opposite of reason? Right. Madness, non-reason. So he spends a lot of time, he's got a section of books, most famously known Madness and Civilization. In the first part of his career, he studies the science of the medical system. And he says that the concept of reason was created, right, to create a category of madness. We create a group that we label as mad so that we can ignore them and oppress them. If you read Madness and Civilization, he does all these, he gives you these really good lines of demonstration to see what he's talking about. He says, anyone who doesn't act normal can be labeled as mentally ill. Of course, at the time they called them mad when the first part of the right? If they don't act normal, then they're sick. And if you don't act normal, you can be eliminated in some way, right? So if you don't act with reason, then you must be using non-reason, which means you are mad, which means I can make you disappear. You're a disposable part of society. Okay, in the 15th century, they had this thing called ships of fools. Have you ever heard of Ship of Fools? There's a song out there, but 15th century. So what we did with our mad is that we put them on these ships. Right? That is a common terminology now you'll hear now in slang. They're just a ship of fools. They literally took people who they deemed as mad and mentally ill, put them on a ship, and sent them off. They didn't want them near them, so they got rid of them. They also, in that time frame, used to have these things called leper islands, right? Who knows what a leper island is? That's right. But you didn't want to be anywhere near that, right? You didn't want to catch it. What's so bad about leprosy? Mike?
Highly contagious.
Contagious? What's it do to you? disfigures you, right?
It's not as contagious as they thought back in the day.
Right. It disfigures you, right? That's not so comfortable. Right? It's not so comfortable for whom? You would think it would be the person, but who are they really concerned about? Christian. Right. They wouldn't want to catch it. They're not perfect. So they created these places, they put them there. Then he goes on to talk about the 17th century. He says, in the 17th century we have the great confinement of people. The 17th century, the great confinement of people. We take all these groups of people that aren't normal, and we put them in these institutions. There's a really cool book that I think you read in high school. I don't know if you read it in Virginia, but I know that we read it in Ohio, about a woman in an institution. That's one of them. There's another one too. Isn't, it might be a short story. Yellow Wall Pipe.
Oh, yeah.
Is that a short story?
It is.
Okay. So this is supposed to be set in that time, right, where the woman's slowly going mad. The question at the end of the short story is, was she mad to begin with? Or did the confinement make her mad? Because that's sort of what he's the point he talks about in this section when he's discussing it is, we took all these people, we put them away because we didn't want to deal with them because they didn't act normal. And also they used to do families who didn't want to deal with their child who wasn't normal, who was mad. They would put him in there. And sometimes these people would create like tombstones for them as if they were dead. Because they weren't normal, they were dead to them. They mourned them. It was not okay back then. He says, then in the 19th century, we started creating this term called mentally ill. Well, it's supposed to be that we're being a little kinder to them, right? We created their own term for them. What do we do with them, though? Maybe we didn't put them on a ship. We don't put all of them in institutions. What do we do with them? Some of them we do, right? You still have your mental wards. You still have institutions. We medicate them heavily. This has become a large business, right? Behavioral modification. Become a huge business. Behavior modification. What is the most common things that kids nowadays are diagnosed with? ADHD, ADD, ADHD, all these different things. Why do they need a diagnosis?
Yeah.
They're not behaving. Right. They don't act normal. They don't sit here nice and quiet like these young ladies. Just take their notes. Right? Yes, sir. Pardon me? What's not true? Right. I never said that was. It's not. I don't think that's even close to the argument I'm trying to make. If you're watching me, what am I trying to say? Right. Right. Follow me. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm talking about the ridiculous nature of this. Right? The people who want to say that like my 4-year-old, he's too hyper. Screw you. If he wants to run around like a crazy man, as long as he's not harming somebody, he's full of energy, why would I ever contain that? How many of you have seen him? He runs around like a wild man. And I wouldn't contain him.
Yes, he does.
Right. Here's what he says they're doing, right? He says what they're trying to do is a form of social control, right? They're normalizing society. We have tried to normalize society. It's normalization. People are being forced to conform to a label. People are being forced to conform to a label. And that higher powers, if you will, or certain powers, are trying to dissuade you from dissent. Trying to dissuade you from dissent. But they try to convince you that there's an ordinary way of being. We as a society decide there's an ordinary way of being. Anybody who acts unordinary, we will deal with them in a particular way. We will normalize them. If they don't conform, we will medicate them or we will shut them away. So he does this whole section on madness and civilization and normalization and how we try to control people, and he thinks about it for a while and he says, this doesn't just apply to the mad. We're doing it other ways too. And he starts to explore some other concepts. So he starts to explore the concept of power. Power. He says the power is the ability to have control over another. Right? Power is controlling power or control over another. He says we can control someone biologically. Right? I can hold someone down. Beat them, I can make them do my bidding. Right? I can have artistic power over them, or educational power over them, right? I am smarter than you, you will listen to me, I am more creative than you, look at my artwork versus your drawing. Right? So power is not just in somebody who can sock you, but I can control you with my mind, right? So power has hierarchies. Power has hierarchies. He says that power, that the state does have power, right? That they're at the top of power relations. But that he's not as concerned about that. He writes a little bit about it. But he's more concerned with social context of power. He's concerned about the power found at the society level. Who does that reference? Power at the society level. Well, who else talks about this? We've already talked about Mill. Right. It's an old concept, and he goes back to him. And he says that we use power to have social control to normalize people. Right? We use power to normalize people. He talks about this thing called disciplinary power. Disciplinary power. Things that I'll order a little bit, sorry. He writes a lot about about disciplinary power if you're interested in discipline and punish and history of sexuality, which are actually very decent reads. History of sexuality, I think, is 3 volumes, if I remember. I have books that make it home. And then there's the book Discipline and Punish. And he says we have disciplinary power all through society. Yes, government uses it as well, but he's not as focused on that. He says that there are 2 technologies of punishment, and that's how we maintain power. So there are 2 technologies of punishment, and that is how we maintain power. The first is monarchical punishment. Monarchical punishment. Okay? This is what he's referring to right before the 18th century. So he's talking about the time of like Bentham and Mill. Right? They had monarchical power. In other words, he also called this a festival of punishment. Festival of punishment. Okay? The power kind of showed its face in few small select individuals, and that this punishment became a festival. Literally, execution was done in public. Okay? Execution was done in public, and these were like festivals. Literally, that's how he describes them. Like families would go to watch the bad person be executed. We're gonna go watch the hanging, or the beheading, or the shooting. And families would go, and they would pack picnics, and they would spend all day, and it was strongly encouraged that you attend. Right? People in their society in their areas or neighborhoods, is how we would think of it now, would go to these things. The idea was that you would repress your population by showing execution and torture to scare them. You see it. You know what's going to happen to you. You watch it. It's brutal. You might watch them cut off a hand, or stone someone, or beat them. But it gets you to listen. You don't want to be that person, right? The Festival of Punishment. I love that term. I don't love the concept. I love the way he labels that time period. After a while, he says, this Festival of Punishment is not working. We still are having a lot of crime. In fact, it's increasing. Right? Why do you think that is? Why is it not working anymore? Why did the Festival of Punishment stop working? No? People can be just disobedient. He doesn't think that people are inherently bad, though. He thinks that people just do
We
what
don't
they
have
will.
that type of monarchical power anymore.
Right. Our government system has changed. That's definitely one observation, that they had to change with the government. Right? His point would be that they disguise their control, right? They're supposed to seem more, utilitarian, but they're supposed
Civilized.
to, right, more civilized. They're a republic now, right? People are more in control. They're not abusing their power, right? Right. So they're trying to make it seem as though they're not that way. But what's another reason? If you've ever read statistics, people got desensitized to these things. They started getting used to it. They knew what was going to happen, right? When you start making decisions, you know what's going to happen. If your parents give you a curfew, you know, I show up late, I'm going to be grounded for a week, or whatever. So you spend some time and you sit back and you say, no, I'm out at a party, I'm having a good time. Things are fun, I know what's going to happen, I'll take that punishment. Right? You evaluate for yourself that you're willing to deal with those consequences. And so it doesn't work because people start knowing what's happening and the government changes. But just because the government changes and just because it's not working doesn't mean they're going to stop trying to control you. So they moved to this concept of disciplinary power. This starts to appear with our modern criminal justice system. In its founding time is when it starts to pop up and it continues. He says now, publicity is not in the punishment, but rather in the judgment. Publicity is no longer about the punishment, but rather the judgment. The judgment. And that's a powerful statement. People no longer watch you get killed or tortured. They get to make judgment on your behavior. Right? Do we televise court hearings? Especially some of the ones that we think are the biggest. Right? Create the most impact. We publicize those. Why? Because we want everybody to see them be judged. Right? Trayvon Martin's case is going on. A witness comes up to testify. If you've paid any attention, media, social media, spend more time ridiculing the witness than they have the act of taking this kid who was walking along and they shot him and killed him. But our focus is on how the witness talks and the things that they say. Think about this. We are publicizing the judgment. Society, we're making a decision. How many of you have stood up and thought to yourself, this person's guilty or not guilty? About any sort of court case, right? How many of you have seen a court decision or heard it on the news and decided, this person is messed up? Guilty, not guilty, come on, we've all done it, I've done it.
I don't.
Okay? If you haven't done it at all, then congratulations, because you've reached a higher level of being to which I have yet reached. Because our instinct as human beings often is to judge. I try very hard not to judge, but I know that I do it. Tap. Battery's dying on the battery, I think. And now think about punishment now. He says, now think about punishment. Nowadays, if an inmate is in jail and you want to visit them, you have to go through a lot of hoops, right? You have to have permission to visit someone in jail. Okay, you have to have permission to visit someone in jail. And people can be denied the ability to visit them. So the government even controls, right, your prisons control who comes to see you. One of the bad sources was people already in jail. Executions are done at night. Executions now tend to be done at night. Why is that? Anyone got a guess?
I think it's, I know they do it like around midnight, like as soon as the day starts, I guess, just to get it over with.
I don't think it has anything to do with them just trying to get it over with.
So like, you just go home afterwards,
You're thinking, right? That's true. There'll be fewer people there because there's not as many guards there, so fewer people involved, which is good for their conscience. But what Sam says is true. It's late at night. Fewer people are up to understand what's going on, right? You're asleep. You're numb to it. It happens, and when you wake up, they're dead. You don't necessarily always know how it happened. You don't know the details, right? How many times did they shock him? How long did it take for them to die from that lethal injection? You don't get those details. Most you get is they executed this person at such and such a time. Now, there are instances where you can still go see an execution, but it's late at night because they're not trying to encourage it to be a spectator sport. Yes.
and you feel like a number if you're going to be executed.
Yes. People don't usually know. And there are too many people that get done watching an execution and go, that's great. I mean, even the people for heinous crimes, right? That's not usually their reaction. I mean, like, they might feel as though maybe justice was served, but you don't usually say, like, I enjoyed that.
Have you watched or read in Cold Blood?
Yes. If you have not, and you're curious about Discipline and Punish, you should see Cold Blood. He says, the reason why disciplinary power is so effective right now is because we don't really know what the punishment is for certain. They tell us, but we're not certain. You don't know what you're going to get, right? There are different levels of punishment in this criminal justice system, right? Some people are put into life in prison. Some people are executed. Some states do lethal injection. Some do the electric chair. A couple still do hanging and being shot by a firing squad. Okay, it's still on the books. Yeah.
Isn't it like sometimes? I know I did research like in budget, like in some states you can actually choose the method.
Yes.
Yes.
Some
But,
states you can.
is
Some
it
you
like-
cannot. I mean, some they have set, like, you know, I know Ohio, Virginia, we know what we're getting.
Would it be like more because of like that type of punishment, or the fact that like for any legal hearing, like there's variances in what the judge
Depends who you ask, right? Some philosophers will say it's because you're still giving them a choice on how they want to die, and you're giving them that choice. Other people, like Foucault, would say the second, right? The government's doing that so that you don't know how you're going to go, and so that people don't know how other people are being executed. He makes some other observations about the legal system. He says, you can't punish the mad, right? We still have this term, the mad, and you can't always punish them. So people who are declared insane are treated differently, right? So now we assess people's mental state. Some felons can be fixed. Right? Some felons can be fixed. We can rehabilitate them, reform them, and return them to society. We can rehabilitate them, return them to society. If we put them in prison for a while, we fix them, we punish them for a while, and we release them. looked at recidivism rates, and anyone can say, well,
John Hinckley Jr.
yes. Every crime, there's an assessment done. Are you mad or not mad? If you are mad, you get treated a little bit differently. If you're considered normal, you get the harshest of punishments, right? And so we've now moved to a place where we assess them. If they're criminally insane, they might go into an institution, right? They might be medicated, monitored. But if you're considered normal, right, that you don't get any sort of insanity plea, you get the swifter punishment, the harder punishment, because you were normal. And you weren't conforming. You violated some social norms. He also says that now what our disciplinary power system does is medico-judicial treatment. We like that a lot. We alter behavior with medication. We alter behavior with medication. So now, the healthcare system, for example, helps us determine what's normal or not normal. They help us judge. The medical system has gotten involved in this now. He says we medicate them, that we have determined that we can create healthy, productive members of society. Yes.
Would that also be like involved with like the pharmaceutical market?
Yes. Right. Big business in those ADHD and ADD medications. Big business. He says that what happens as a result of disciplinary power is that, again, we self-police. We self-regulate. When he's talking about the self-regulation, self-policing, he talks a lot about our friend Bentham, which is why we've already talked about. He did not invent the idea. He doesn't invent the idea of self-regulation, right? And the Panopticon he talks about a lot here. He says that the Panopticon demonstrates an idea of modern punishment, right? The fact that you're always being watched controls you, and it controls what you're doing. We self-regulate. You are always being watched. You don't know when you're being watched. Spend some time looking around occasionally when you're out someplace. You might notice this.
Long ago, our ancient ancestors imagined an omniscient God, able to see all that we do. This God would judge all actions and punish misdeeds, either in this life or the next. Fearing punishment from this all-seeing eye of a wrathful God, devout citizens followed a system of morals and ethics, for even what the law was blind to, God would see and punish. Today, not much escapes the eye of the law. Cameras are perched atop poles all along the highway, on the corners of buildings, in parking lots, apartment complexes, and inside stores, restaurants, and offices. The internet traffic is monitored now, almost globally, censored and watched in China and India, stored and scanned in England, and heavily monitored in the United States by the Einstein program, an NSA-mandated complete internet oversight project enacted as a part of the controversial Patriot Act. Phone calls have been tapped without warrant, and text messages are logged. Background checking companies access social networking sites where any number of acquaintances have tagged photographs of you anywhere and everywhere. Internet service providers keep logs of your internet use to create a consumer profile that they sell to advertising companies and anyone else with enough money. You get nothing, aside from privacy violation. Are you being watched? There's no longer any doubt about that. This continual observation of the public conjures images of the Orwellian Big Brother. 1984 is continually monitoring propaganda box installed in every citizen's home and work. It also makes you watch yourself, if only because you feel like you're being watched by someone else. Even if no one can see, you still fear the prying eye of your tattletale neighbor or a powerful government. You fear driving too fast because of speed traps and unmarked police cars. They could be lurking in an alley or behind a tree or sign somewhere. And if they aren't, there are cameras to automatically issue tickets. Officials even scan roadside camera footage to mail out tickets for parking violations when no one was around to personally ticket, tow, or boot your car. This is the Panopticon. First designed by the English utilitarian social reformer Jeremy Bentham in 1785, the panopticon is a cylindrical wall of prison cells surrounding a central tower. Atop this tower is a room circled by 360 degrees of one-way mirror, allowing for a gunman to see everyone, but for no one to see where he is aiming. Out of fear, the prisoners watch themselves, assuming that they are targeted at any given moment. But with this sentiment of an invisible omniscience, it becomes unnecessary to even have an armed guard at all. Consider the infrequent amount of wiretapping and internet investigations now, despite heavy media coverage. Look around at all the dummy cameras that look exactly like the real thing, but record nothing at all. Is this not a modern technological panopticon? French philosopher Michel Foucault transformed this concept into what he termed disciplinary society, fearing at all times the eye of the law. Because we know we might be watched, and might therefore be punished, we obey whatever laws are enacted, and even fear to speak out against those laws that seem unfair. So why is the panopticon an evil mechanism? Some might claim that despite violating privacy and personal liberties, that constant surveillance seriously reduces criminal activity. Perhaps, but in the absence of cameras, in a power outage, by cutting the cables, by masking your IP address, or making anonymous phone calls in phone booths, crime will thrive. This is because the fear of discipline has replaced mankind's reverence for ethics and morality. People fear the police rather than attempt to make positive decisions merely for the sake of being a good citizen. They broadcast their good deeds on MySpace or Facebook to show everyone how compassionate they are. Is this not merely selfish promotion in the guise of charity? Replacing the individual morality and the democratic evolution of an ethical system with a central lawmaking body that has eyes all over the globe and an unrestricted permit to kill and imprison makes a simulacra of our decision-making abilities. Our kindnesses and distaste for unethical behavior are delegated to others. Why think about what's wrong if someone else is there to do it for you? Why apprehend a criminal when someone else is there to catch them? Under the all-knowing, all-seeing eye of the modern panopticon, no one cares, and those that do are afraid to speak up.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the things he says there. Right, if you've never read 1984, you are missing out. Great piece of literature, and it's becoming eerily true. So if you're into things like critical literature, and you're into these sorts of things, I suggest you read 1984. Right, Big Brother is always watching you. Thought police, right? People become afraid to even think about things because the police in 1984 are able to see what you're thinking. So you can't even think about speaking against the state. Some other things I want to point out from that clip. The eye in the pyramid. Do you know where that is? On our dollar bill. So even when we're handing out our money, the eye is upon you. Right? Some other things that talks about that was really in line with Foucault is that disciplinary power, a disciplined society, creates fear. Right? We are fearful. We don't know when we're being watched. So we are afraid to speak out. It has no longer become a question of whether or not we're making decisions based upon our own moral ethic, or if we're making decisions based upon we're being watched, and this is the way we think we should be acting because we've been normalized. And in a smaller social context, which is what Foucault is most concerned about, think about this. You're in a room full of people. A couple of kids decide to start bullying and picking on another. These couple of kids tend to be more of the leaders of the pack, if you will. And so other people sit there and say nothing. This kid has been tortured at school and goes home and he kills himself. Who in that room is responsible for that? What? Right. The person who sits there quietly because it's become normalized to them that you sit there and let the leaders do what they're going to do. It's a very small scale example, example of how this works in our society. Okay? We become normalized. We're afraid to speak out. So it's not just Big Brother and the government that's doing it. We do it in small settings. Right? We have gotten to the point that we're normalized, that we conform to the way things should be, and we can't always check what for us is part of our moral code. And I find this particularly problematic for younger people. I find that, I'm kind of sad for all of you. You're young. You're still developing your sort of moral code, but I hope you can start to know there's some baseline things from which you would start to act. Right? So Coe talks about biopower. Biopower, which is this is what this is. Right? Control or power over bodies is literally what it means. Biopower. Power, you don't use the word power because I hate it when people define a word with words. Control over bodies. And he says, power is fluid. Power is fluid. It goes back and forth between us, right? It isn't just all one way. One person asserts power and the other one gives into the power. Right? I sit here, up here in charge, but you have all given in to the power at this moment to allow me to speak, right? Remember, I referenced some of this in the philosophy overview last week. You give power to different things. So in that video clip, they talk about in sort of the baseline of philosophy, they started who had power, who was in charge, how did you make decisions? God, religion, right? We talked about that last week. How a lot of philosophy started with whether or not does God exist, right? And that how they use God or religion to control what you do, to conform you, to normalize you. It's just filtered down to different groups who have taken that power, right? And so he says that there's power all through society. How we act in school, how we act in debate camp, how we act in cafeteria, right, are all indication of what we've learned as acceptable social behavior and social norms, right? If you don't understand what biopower is, the most classic example, right, is a traffic light. You're driving down the road, you're driving, you don't drive yet, it'll be exciting to you someday. Driving down the road, come to a red light. No one's around. It's the middle of the night. And there's that moment of decision making. Do I stop or do I not stop?
First you have to look around.
Right, or do I do the rolling stop? No one's coming? And I keep going. Right? The most classic example is that we have these expectations. We all know what red means. What does red mean? What does green mean? Right? My little boy is 4. He tells you that right away. Right? But we're stopped at the light. He sings a song. Green light, we need a green light. Because he understands what is expected of us. Right? And so most people stop. And they wait there. And the crickets are going. Right? And you're waiting. That's biopower, right? Same thing I did before. Last week. Devin, stand up. Stand up. Stand up. I win. Right? Biopower. He's not quite sure what's acceptable or unacceptable, right? I'm down here. I'm in charge. And so he says the biopower exists everywhere. And again, he says it's even most dangerous in these sort of social contexts. I'm a pretty powerful speaker, I would think. Am I somewhat persuasive? I could probably persuade you to do some things, given the right circumstances. That's dangerous. That's how things get started. Okay. He also talks about this concept of knowledge power, right? He says the people who know stuff have power, right? And I want to talk about that for a second because it's important for me as an educator to emphasize this to you. Okay? He writes a book, Knowledge, Power. I don't. And he talks about how the people who have the information have power. And here's what they do. People who have knowledge, They manipulate the knowledge that they have, right, to maintain control. They manipulate the power they have to maintain control. We can use knowledge, right, to create power discipline. We can use knowledge to create power discipline. We can create soldiers. We create leaders. Right? We have leader seminars and leadership camps. We use knowledge to create these things. We start already. Jackie, do me a favor. You come down and talk to. See you take care of this. I see E is Brian. You can just call him and give him this information. You'll call him right there. Yeah. You can see if you have that information. All right. So he says we can create these people. We create leaders, and we create soldiers, and by proxy we create the people who are not leaders. Right? The followers. You see this in government, right? We create our leaders in certain countries. You've seen it at Mexico, Cuba, and Venezuela. But we also do this on a smaller societal scale, in that we pick who our leaders are. Think about your group of friends. You all kind of know you have someone that's sort of the leader of your pack, right? Yes. And think about your classroom. Is there someone who's sort of the leader of your class? Right. Okay. So he's saying, look, we are all part of a system of control. From the lowest levels to the highest levels of the government through disciplinary power. Right? That filters, disciplinary power filters through all of us because we live in this system of biopower. And it's always there. Now at the end of all of this, a lot of people will ask, well, what's the alternative? Foucault doesn't get into a lot of alternatives. He passes away before he really explores that. Other than to really spend some time, you control your own agency. He doesn't believe in reform. Foucault doesn't believe in reform. He says, attacking power in one area just makes that power go up in another. Power is always going to exist. It's always there. It's his argument. And because it is fluid. And it ebbs and flows. And so if this area here has a lot of power, and you decrease their power, the natural reaction is that the power goes up here. Okay. So true reform, you're just going to create problems in some other area. We use reform, he says, to make it look like we're helping, right? But really, it's just because we've come up with another way to control, right? We use reform to make it look like we're helping, but really we've just come up with another way to control. Okay, if you want to apply this to government, we give a country humanitarian aid. Do we give it to our BFFs? We give humanitarian aid to our BFFs if they need it, other countries that are close friends. Some of you say yes, some of you say no. To me, that already indicates what I'm pointing out, right? You can't clearly say yes or no. Often when we give aid, what does it come with? It comes with strings attached, right? We want to be involved in what they're going to do. The same is true on a smaller societal scale. How many of you have seen this? Somebody helps you out a lot, and then they ask you for a favor and you can't do it? But I do so much for you. Why can't you do this thing for me? Right? Kind of get the idea? Right, so he doesn't think that reform is going to be quite as altruistic as people think. We're not going to get these great things happening. Foucault's work is used by later movements because people start to recognize, right? First of all, they recognize the problem. The problem is power and who controls it. Right? So people start to use Foucault's work and it makes some realizations. Number one, they recognize the problem is power and who controls it. Two, they recognize the power is fluid, so they can take the power back. Okay? They can reject those power structures. They recognize, three, that knowledge is power. And so people start to understand things like, our educational system is messed up. Why are certain groups of people getting more privileged information than others? And they start to make reforms to our education system. I have no idea. I'm just making it up. I think it was power. Something about power. I don't know. Huh? What? Oh, who controls power? Right? They recognize the power is out there. The issue is power, and they have to recognize who controls the power. What was number two? Power is fluid, so you can take the power back. I remember that part. And three was?
Knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power. So they start to understand they need to gain access to power. Right? They need to get, and the way to do that is with knowledge in multiple ways, right? Increase your education, fix the education system, or use an avenue to get information out to people that wouldn't normally get it. Social media. What started the Arab Spring? Does anyone know? Does anybody know what got things kicked off in the Arab Spring?
Social media.
Social media, right. Okay. They started using Facebook. People were complaining about some person, right, who'd been attacked in Tunisia. And everybody took to Facebook, and it just created this sort of rise to power mentality. And so they start to understand that knowledge is power, both in that they need to have knowledge and education, because education is key to gaining power, but also they can, to disseminate information is important to get knowledge out there. Fourth, they come to understand, people come later to the realization that if they understand the concepts of power and biopower and social context of power, that a good way to create change is on a smaller scale. Social movements. Right, a good way to produce change is through social movements. Right. Most of your major movements have started on a small scale. The civil rights movement. How does it really get started? How the civil rights movement gets started? What kicks off in the 60s? Well, really I think it was the late 50s. That really kicks things off. Right. One lady, one little old lady, refuses to sit in the back of the bus, and she sits up front. Some people go to Greensboro and they sit at a lunch counter. Feminist movement. What are some of the things that kick that off?
Bra burning.
Right. Right? Bra burning has become the great symbol of feminism.
Yeah.
It's not all that, but yeah. Right? Some women started saying enough of this. Right? All of something huge, right? Somebody didn't call the president and be like, I think that. Okay? The women's movement actually started in like the early 1900s. Right? If you ever follow women's suffrage, right? There's this really cool place in New York that talks about women's suffrage. That on the way home from a debate camp once, I took my two strong female debaters and we spent the whole day in the Women's Rights Museum, and it was awesome. But it started with small groups of women in their own neighborhood who would do things like picket and, they wanted to vote. The idea is that it's not an overnight occurrence, right? Movement, reform does not occur overnight, but rather it builds momentum, and it starts in a smaller scale, and these things sort of kick off. But if you recognize if people start to learn how power works, and most of these movements, I think, get a lot of their understanding from Foucault, which is why we're spending time on it before we're going to jump to Jackie in a few minutes, all right? That they use those concepts to understand something. They understand they are trying to understand how to gain power. And they also do a good job of looking back to where they've been, right? A movement has to measure itself against where it's been. They know they have to understand sort of the history of philosophy of their movement, of what people have traditionally had or not had. They have to examine the way people think to get into their psyche to make positive social change. And they have to have a rally point, right? Small groups have a rally point. Every social movement has a rally point. Okay? So we'll transition to Jackie now. She's going to talk to you about race theory. But first we're going to listen to something that I think introduces Jackie really well. I just want you to put your pens down. If you haven't seen this movie, I love this movie. I think this is a very powerful moment. Don't talk. It gets louder. That. I give you something to think about, and I set up for Jackie. take a 5-minute break so Jackie can get set up.
We took like 5 pages from those.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
Stop. There's vending machines down on the bottom floor. You go into H, so it's like right out there and then down to the bottom floor.
Okay.
There's vending machines. That's all.
The base was crazy. It was actually like vibrating at desk. So why do you carry such a big bag? How big this is? It was dreaming in sleep the whole time.
Not here.
Yeah.
Yep. Like, you gotta hold it down for like.
I need this. I don't need it. That's my cage. For its
Yes.
He did that yesterday too, right? Remember?
Was it so good?
Oh, that's fun.
sugar.
That's not all right.
That's exactly.
I know, it's like,
Old? I was up there like starting to get sweaty.
You must move around and.
Yes, I am. I'm taking a little bit workout when I do that too.
Chilling, you're probably chilling.
Yeah, probably. I hope so.
Dude. That's good. Short. Yes, you have to read. Why? It's painful. Do that for me.
So crazy.
That's what they're already doing. I always quit.
No, that's for.
Which one is for?
Trust me, I drank one of those. I used to drink, I brought like what's today?
Oh yeah,
One time. It was exciting.
Yeah, it probably wasn't.
It was Springbrook, so I didn't get much sleep, so I was just like down and
It's the whole shot, like 3/4 of the amount of caffeine in Monster.
Monster doesn't.
No,
That's a lot of caffeine. That's like 3 times from.
It's like one thing Monster and it's one. Alright. I'll tell you all a little about myself before I start. I was born in Philadelphia, walked over and moved there, but I guess the interesting part of my story is that my grandma immigrated during the Holocaust, and during that time, you can obviously imagine there's a lot of problems going on internationally, a lot of people being subjugated for reasons that people should not ever be judged for. Thankfully, my family got out of the oppression that they were in and were able to come somewhere where they were at least treated a little better than where they originally were from. My great-grandma was in Auschwitz and came over and sadly gave my grandma up for adoption because it was just a really hard time and kind of separated herself from the oppression that she had experienced at the hands of the person who had power where she was in. The reason I give you that story is just everyone's identity has some sort of connection to the history that they themselves or their family have experienced. It's kind of hard to speak from my position because now I'm just someone where you could just look at me and be like, this is a white girl speaking about oppression, what the hell does she know? Probably not as much as some of you do, honestly. And it's sad that some people have to know what it feels like to be judged, what it feels like to walk in a room and people be afraid of you because they're afraid you're going to steal their purse because of some sort of stereotype that your gender, your race has. And it's sad that we have to learn about stuff like this because it shouldn't exist. But it does. And because it exists, learning about it gives us a better understanding and gives people the ability to bring themselves out of situations that they're in, or at least leverage their situation in a better way. This is going to be more of a discussion back and forth. I think that's the best way that we're going to really learn about some of these really hot issues that don't get talked about as much as they should. So I want someone to raise their hand and tell me maybe an instance you've seen of just racial oppression or racism.
It's not to be racism, can't be sexism.
We're going to get onto that. We're going to talk more and more about every single instance, or at least as much as I can talk about in the time I have. But just racial oppression. I can start walking into a Walmart with my boyfriend, having the Walmart attendant pat down my boyfriend because he was black. I was ignored because I was white. Stuff like that shouldn't happen. Maybe some other things that you've experienced or things you've seen your friends experience. Don't be shy.
Well, I have not experienced racism directly towards me, but I graduated in 1964, so that's when the Civil Rights Movement actually kind of peaked. But I was raised in a small town in West Virginia, a coal mining town, and my parents were complete racists, I mean totally, not just against African Americans, but I wasn't allowed to date anyone who was Italian, Hungarian, they called Italians Dagos and Wops. I couldn't date anybody from Hungary, they were called Hunkies. You have to imagine that in the coal mining regions, people came from all over the world to work there, so they could get a job. I couldn't date anyone who was Polish or Hungarian. I won't tell you what they called African Americans. We all know what they called African Americans. So they had a name for Polacks were Polish, Kites, Jewish. So they were completely bigoted against anybody who wasn't white. Boy, Catholics too.
Oh, of
Let's
course.
not forget Catholics. So they were completely bigoted against everybody.
Yeah.
But of course, as I grew up and went to college and joined armies and all these things, I knew that that was total ignorance.
Yeah.
That people are people and they're good
Why?
and bad and they're good.
Why do you all think? I'll take some more. Devin.
Oh, okay. One of my personal instances was I dated this girl, Nikki Hodges. Her parents didn't know that we were dating, and one day I decided to hang out in her house, and her parents took her aside and made her help me because they wanted to keep it light. Yeah, and they treated relationships like marriage, so after that she couldn't ever date anyone who wasn't married. So.
Yeah.
My dad is racist against people from the Middle East and certain African countries. Along with his really long racist rants about how these people are inferior because they're not American and he has all sorts of ways for them. It's pretty horrifying.
Like usually Asian parents who like immigrate from Asia, like actually are from Asia, like have a really strong sense of like racism, just because like in the history when we met Americans and stuff, like kind of the Americans sense that like racism to like Asian countries and oh, this race is bad, this race is bad. Then, like, time passed, and now I think U.S. is like kind of more leaning towards solving racism, while in the countries where they told them racism was bad, they're actually not improving. So I feel like other countries where America has interacted with are more like struck with racism than the United States.
Okay, so well, I live in downtown Irvington, so every day driving home, when it's dark at night, you will see many police squad cars just hanging out around the streets because they're expecting black people to come out. Every time a black person comes out, I see it. Immediately, 5 policemen come out the car, surround the person, pat them down along the wall like this. I see it every day, and I turn away and we keep driving.
Does anyone know what that's called?
Racial profiling.
Thinking that certain races are more prone to crime than other races.
Like, my grandma, I guess, was really conservative. It's not my mom, but like, they were all like immigrants, and my grandma, like, considered on like the right kind of bitch, remember? Like, she came here and she was like in like the class and she learned how to speak English and stuff. And she finished something. She once had this very like big American ideal, and she's always like talking to someone else like, I'm definitely being told about Gail. And find like a husband that way, you know. Well, it would have been worse if she was dark. We wouldn't have liked that, so it's just kind of like that.
Yeah.
Vision.
Where do you all think, like, obviously, just racism or, like, judging people did not just come out of the blue. What are some thoughts, maybe, of reasons that stuff like this happens? Christian?
I know, like, I got really into, like, Japanese history when I was there, my family background. I know because, like, how separated they were from, like, the rest of the world. They were terrified of, like, the blue-eyed barbarian kind of thing that if you leave our country, they wouldn't let you come back. Like, for the longest time, if you were, like, in prison, if you came back, you wouldn't let you back to society because they were brainwashed you. So, like, that idea that, like, how separated we were for so long kind of thing helped develop these trends, though.
Yeah.
So, just to,
Some other thoughts, Xander?
I think that racism, discrimination against people who are different, and trace back to their core fear of things that are just different and blame and hate. There's no, I think, real reason for it when you get right down to it, other than anger. And the bad parts of us just don't like that.
I think some of this like religious differences, like people that struggle, and then people just associate like people who are part of that religion or something like with that race, and then
Yeah, we especially see that now with instances of like xenophobia and racism towards like people from Muslim countries. We see that against people, even judging people in Utah. Like every instance of a different religion that we don't think is normal gets judged. Every instance of a skin color or way of acting that we don't see as normal gets judged. Shin.
I think it's kind of like a social construct and how like the mindset that was constructed like many years ago. In the beginning, there was this otherization between like the norm and the other, which I think it still lasts because originally like people weren't used to different cultures, so once they came in and met, there always was that difference, there always was that other, and so that social construct and mindset has been lasting years and years. There still is the construct between the norm and the other.
That's actually a large part of some of the literature I'm going to talk about in a little bit of social construction of difference.
yeah, to go off of what Shannon said, like, I'm sorry, many years ago, I think, well, I think, well, you're going to tell me if I'm wrong, but the primitive start of it was what was considered as decivilized, like what they consider as uncivilized, how you acted, where you were, and then your skin color only perpetuated that.
Yeah, that like beginning of many instances you see of like European racial like differences was just the European, the British, these people are civilized. They have houses that aren't built out of mud. It's a different way of living. Oh, they have titles. We see them as better than the other nations around us that don't have any sort of stable governmental system. How dare they?
I think for anyone who's read To Kill a Mockingbird, I think it's something like that where it goes way back to just racial profiling, just because of disagreements about who should be in what position, and now I guess it's not necessarily moved its way out of society yet.
Sure, I want to hone in on that for a second. A lot of times you see in legislation bills getting pushed to solve all instances of racism, or this is definitely going to make everything better. Let's integrate schools. That's gonna solve all the reasons that white people hate black people. Let's do this. It's gonna solve all the reasons that this happens. Is that true?
No.
Why not? Let's get some new hands. Come on.
I think a lot of racism comes from like people like to think in groups. So it's like my group.
The first group thing.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to give the definition of group thing?
herd mentality.
A herd mentality. A lot of times this happens if you see parents who are racist. Their kids are racist because we've always done it that way. Oh, that's always what we thought. I don't really know why I think that. It's just I've been raised to think that. And then the grandchildren think that way. And it continues. And what will break that? How can you break apart group thought dynamic that's existed for hundreds and hundreds of years? Devin?
Critiquing the way you think about it.
Yeah.
Just sit down and just think, what am I doing? Why am I thinking this instead of just doing it?
Sure. Shannon?
The reason a lot of it remains is because of just the things said on the daily. If you listen to people's comments, there's so many racial comments considered as jokes, but all those jokes are doing is entrenching us within racial racism. People make jokes like, even that Asian are supposed to be good at math. If you're Asian, should you be good at math? That's still entrenching us in the fact that there is the other and the norm. So it's not going to change unless people change their language.
Sure. Language is a key aspect. What is something else that's just probably needs to be thought about, maybe addressed?
I think a lot of times racism is used to justify either pure calculation or naked aggression. So European countries use racism to colonize other countries, and they knew it was wrong, but they used racism to say it was okay because they felt these people inferior. Or
I want to point out something specific that you said. Racism isn't just me as a person hates you. I'm going to do things. The problem with racism, it's used as a justification to do horrible things on the governmental level. I want some instances, besides the one that Monica gave, of governmentally mandated racism. Devin?
I'm just thinking, not just like government, but just like not having something to do with contact.
Yeah, sure. Some others, new hands, come on.
Well, this is sort of like off what Devin said, but like the extreme disproportionate, like that the disproportionality of like racism in Congress.
Sure. I saw your hand, Melissa.
We war against in the Middle East and Iraq because they had weapons, and brown people are irrational. They can't handle weapons.
Of course not.
They're not loyal like us. They only white people get weapons.
Sure.
Jim Crow laws.
Yeah. Laws put in place. Totally racist. Madison. Yeah. It didn't just happen in isolated periods. You hear genocide came about because of the Holocaust, but major instances that are so similar of genocide have occurred throughout history.
What the cops consider to be urban blight, they try to remove throughout the different.
Exactly. I did a huge research of how housing works in the United States. I did it for the last research topic we had in college. And, oh my word, every instance of just like the government trying to help is often just guised in obvious racism. Like the desire to take out urban communities, because for some reason we think urban communities are scary. And a whole neighborhood filled with black people, can't have that, gotta put them somewhere else. But on the other side, can't put black people in with white people. Can't do that.
Who's the young lady who was talking about the other down there?
Shannon.
Yeah, I'm gonna add on to what Shannon said. I really believe that racism or all the isms are based on human beings. Think about way back far from where we were thinking about primitive human beings and resources and how they started grouping together in groups and tribes. And how they would fight for various resources, and any other tribe that was different, it didn't have to be skin or anything. Back then, it's just a different tribe, and so they fear. It's all based on fear. They fear the other because they think the other is going to take what they have, whether it's their women, their property, or whatever that is.
And here's the question.
And it's still there, that fear of the other. I hate to say it, but I think you're hardwired for that. But don't even think about race. Think about how many of you have been walking down the street and you see somebody who is deformed in any way, like their face is like deformed, or their dwarves, or any way deformed.
Any type of physical,
you will
mental
feel
differences.
Because that there's the other is so different.
Sure.
So I think we're hardwired, and we have to really consciously.
Now here's the question on that. If this is something that has such historical basis, do you think that Band-Aid solutions are going to solve? Do you think that laws would solve?
But it helped. I
They
mean, the
could,
Civil Rights
yeah.
Movement and all the Johnsons, the Civil Rights Act and things, those things help.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You can't throw that out entirely.
How, isn't there some sort of understanding of history that has to happen to get where maybe root causes, you hear that a lot in scholarly debate, but not even just root causes, but understanding specific isolated instances and what the history is there. Like, why, we talked about this I think in LD, or maybe it was in my hegemony lecture, of why something like the Holocaust happened. What were the motivating influences there? Economic strife, scapegoating. This happens in many other instances throughout U.S. history. Slavery was not mentioned by any of you. Huge instance of racism that is often just guised over saying, oh, they just needed something that was a little more economically profitable. Here's a question for all of you. It was all about economics. Why didn't you get slaves from Europe?
Actually, there's actually a lot of, I think it was Wilderson, I think I read.
We're gonna get to them too.
Yeah, he wrote about it would have been not only cheaper to use European slaves, but it would have been so much easier to actually have economic development in America if you were just easier.
Yeah.
Because it would have cut shipping costs by so much.
Yeah,
But Europeans were also going through the same sort of thing that was going on in the United States. They were using slaves too, not just Americans, but the whole social thing. And we were Europeans.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. They were us. Why would we take another upstanding European when we can go to Africa and pick up people that we don't see as humans because they're different. They don't look like us. They don't act like us.
Darwin
We're
had a lot of
better
influence
than that.
on this too.
We'll add to that.
Yeah, sure. Actually, initially when Americans came to the United States, what would become the United States, they started using indentured servants, who were white people that they would pay to come from Europe into the United States, and who would eventually be released from their servitude. However, the problem with that was that they would be dissatisfied if they weren't given enough compensation upon their release. So that we're afraid that white people had minds to think and stand up for themselves, whereas black people or people from other countries or people that weren't like them, didn't speak their language, did not have minds to stand up
see how problematic that is. Where a lot of this has just repeated itself to where my lecture is going to be not just about race, but about gender, about sexual identification, where these are all just so entwined because white man looks at a woman, she's different. She's irrational. Oh my goodness. 12 times a year, she just does not know what decisions to make. We've heard it. We've heard critiques of why women can't be presidents. What about that time? She's not going to be able to decide what to do with Afghanistan. She's going to be so angry, she'll make a decision that is just not good for our country. Irrational. The same type of adjectives are deployed against every identity that's seen as different. It's irrational. You hear that all the time. You hear different ways of thinking is a big one. Oh, women just think differently than men. Oh, black people think differently than white people. Oh, those Asians and Jews, they think differently. Oh, they don't have lives, they're forced to work and study. These are all just stereotypes that are continually forced upon identity groups because we see them as different. Let's not even get into sexual difference. You see that all over the news now with the DOMA decision. We gotta put in a constitutional law because what I believe is different than what you believe. And my beliefs obviously take precedent. See that all the time. Little bit of lecture. Sorry if it's boring. But who knows of, under racial studies, there is a large term that began the studies, and it's called white supremacy. Does anyone know the definition for that? Come on, let's all Devin's hand first.
I don't know the exact technical
That's
definition,
fine.
but I believe it's white people believing that they're better than everyone else.
That's a really, that's the start, the foundation. I have a definition, you can write it down if you want. It's that political, economic, and cultural system where whites overwhelmingly control, which is not one thing. Kristie talked about power, but they also control material resources. I know that was mentioned. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted on a broad array of institutions and social settings. Really long definition. The basis of this means, you know what? It's not just that whites control politics. It's that empirically they've controlled resources. They have large control of trade. It's not just politics, but it's culture, where white culture is seen as something that should be spread. Black culture, Islamic culture, all these other cultures are seen as something that has to be contained. Can't have Muslim beliefs widespread because that's too scary. Can't have black culture widespread because they're too crazy. Can't have Jewish culture widespread because they're greedy. It's all about white culture and how that is the normalized idea that should be widespread. Now, the last part of this definition takes into account that it's not just conscious ideas that are widespread, but white supremacy is something that is unconscious, where a person can be walking by not knowing thoughts that they're having that are just of the norm, but they have them, and they act on them, where your actions you may have justified as rational, but in the end, the basis for them was you were trying to be normal, acting in the ways that are expected, didn't want to act the way that was unexpected. Can you give me an example of what I mean? And it was kind of a little deeper, so it might be hard to kind of associate unconscious thoughts with certain actions.
I don't know, I'm kind of questioning this.
Sure.
But whenever Kristie was talking about leaders in the class, I immediately I don't want to sound arrogant or anything, but I immediately thought being a Christian, just in this class in general. And then I immediately thought of Christian. I don't know why, but I just thought Christian was like more leader in the class, and I'm trying to think about it. Maybe it's that white supremacy thing in the back of my head. That's kind of what I'm thinking at this point. That's what's going through my head.
No, like I think that's honestly like on the rudimentary level, that's a really good example because this happens in politics where people can't explain why they don't want Obama to lead, but there's something in the back of their mind where they're like, Mitt Romney has just such better poise. Mitt Romney just seems like he would know what he's talking about. That guy over there, I don't know. I'm not really sure, but it's just unconscious patterns that lead to decisions that we can't really justify. We don't really know why. It's just a gut feeling we have. Jen.
There's also another example of like when you're in a neighborhood with all African Americans and there's like white people, they have like this, they're like scared. They have this thing that they see like African Americans as like scared.
This happens a lot of times. Like one of my favorite debaters in college debate talked all about just every case he made was about racial politics and what goes on in America, how that's a problem. And he would he rapped, which I loved about it. So I would go watch all his rounds. And started one of his first speeches with a rap that gave a story of how he was in an elevator and there was a white woman in there. A little bit. Just a little scared. Why? Who cares? Why are you doing that? Why do you assume that a person that you think looks different than you will act different than what you want them to? Where does that assumption come from? Does it come from the media, where crime statistics are distorted so that you believe a certain race commits more crimes, when in reality, it's probably because the police are told to target certain races above other races? Where the statistics that are true are that white women of the age of 40 are the ones who steal the most. But who do we target when we're a security officer in the Walmart? Not the white woman who's 40, because we think she'll spend money. So white supremacy was the overarching concept that started literature and studies about race studies. Under this bank, you have, and I'm skipping a ton, so if you watch the video, or if you're taking notes, and then you go study, and you're like, Jackie, you skipped so much shit, I'm sorry. I can't talk about all of it in an hour and a half.
Yeah, I was just starting to realize.
Oh yeah.
You're blocking.
Maybe you're blocking my beautiful face. It's fine.
I just walked in and I was like,
I like it. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to highlight on is critical race theory. Critical race theory started just as what it sounds like. It was a critical examination of society and culture, broadly. How the races, law, and power are intrinsically tied in how things are affected. You can see this. It was mainly a response to the civil rights movement. Kristie mentioned this. But, there was a lot of criticism over the civil rights movement. Not just from the racists who didn't want it to happen, but from scholars, black scholars, gender scholars, who saw that even though the civil rights movement achieves great things, oftentimes it was colorblind. Colorblind. but it was focusing on direct aspects of discrimination. What were those direct acts of discrimination that the civil rights movement focused on? Some new hands. Come on. Learned about it in history class, I hope to God. I'm still waiting. Yeah, like it was a focus on what we could see. We could see that there were separate drinking fountains. We could see that we had to sit in different areas on the bus. We could see that racism, and we wanted to solve it. But oftentimes, even though it had a connection to race, it didn't focus on the broader aspect of how that inequality started and why that inequality still happens. Instead, it was like, let's not have those things. Let's create laws so that we have to let different races be equal. But let's not study why people feel that way. Why the law is put in place in a way that allows for racial oppression to happen. So, critical race theorists wanted to more get to the heart of the issue, to study how the law, how society, and how race can be tied to find better solutions, or be tied to find out why that happens. Study laws that were put in place. 3/5 compromise. Not just the civil rights movement. Laws of property. Laws of every sort. All that are intrinsically tied to allow for oppression to continue. Marco.
So, like, were the scholars who were critical of the civil rights movement, did they say, like, that because it was only working on what we could actually observe, then it would be harder for, like, society as a whole to get to the heart of the matter? Like,
That was a large part of it. There were other parts that saw the civil rights movement as not being connected to a historical understanding or a historical solution of why that shit's going on. Why are people racist? Why does the law let this happen? They saw the civil rights as a band-aid approach. Like, let's solve instances like this. Let me step back for a second, though. In no way am I saying that what happened in the civil rights movement was a bad idea. The critical race theorists instead said, we can't take singular approaches. We need to have a broader knowledge of why this shit goes down and how we can leverage legal institutions to have a better solution than what happened in the civil rights movement. You continue on, though, in critical race theory, where they had a couple tenets. The first was that they acknowledged that white supremacy, remember that was just white control over resources, culture, it was control over the political institutions, etc. They understood that and racial power, are historically maintained. And the law could play a role in the process. So that's the first tenet. They understand racial oppression is about history. It's not just isolated instances. And they had a hope that they could use legal institutions. They had a second one, though. They didn't just want to use the legal institutions. They wanted to transform how the legal institutions and racial movements worked. Hopefully together. What's one instance you could see as historical opposite during the civil rights movement? Did the legal institution want to work with the civil rights movement? Hell no. They were full of racists who didn't want to change anything. Critical race theory hoped that over time, that relationship could be transformed so that we could use legal institutions side by side with no hope that they would try to stamp down the progress. In the end, it was more a project of, one, just racial emancipation over a broad aspect, but also fighting anti-subordination, or working for. But some people didn't think that this was enough. That's how we get to a new step in race scholarship. We get a new definition, which is whiteness. I assume a lot of the debaters in this room have heard this term at least once in their life. Whiteness began in scholarship, and this is one thing I want to highlight. You don't hear me saying author names. That's because if I try to start naming authors, this lecture would take all day. Because I love this stuff. So if you want to learn more, if you want titles, if you want authors, if you want books, I have bookshelves filled with this stuff. I have PDF docs on my computer. I have sites. Come to me, ask me, tell me what you want to learn about, and the next day, give me at least 24 hours, I will have it put together and give it to you. Just a little FYI. Alright, so whiteness was a new concept that began understanding that white superiority, it's not just kind of like it happened. It's what Shannon said, where it was socially constructed in history to allow for white groups to have more power. It's not just they were born in the beginning of time and we were like, hey, that guy. No. Groups got power through economic, social means and then constructed reality in the way that helped them.
Ultimately, is white supremacy, does it come from like natural selection by Charles Darwin, like the fact that like the survival of the fittest?
Darwin definitely had it.
Yeah.
Darwin was a racist. Darwin and his thoughts led to a lot of justifications for this.
Especially the poet.
Yes. Hello. But people use Darwin's logic to say, look, come on. We got the money. We got the political power. They could have got it, but they didn't. We did. And then justified that as continuing power, letting that dynamic continue, become greater, affect more aspects of civilization, such on. So yeah, that's a very good connection there. But, go ahead.
Well, it was actually a documentary in a book. It's called Germs. I think it's Germs, Guns, and Steel. Yeah, by Jared Diamond. And he basically talks about like how it was like natural resources of, like that white people had, which like led to them being like more advanced.
Yeah. Like, looking through history, doing a genealogical study would be complicated. But just think of it in general. Maybe, most people say the reason there are different races or people look different is because they were from different areas. Not because they were better, not because some supernatural force came down and said, you're white, you're black, because I like you better, or something like that. No, it was people who have darker skin were in harsher climates, so they needed darker skin so that they didn't burn to death like an Irish white person would if they went down to Africa. Sorry, Jack. Jack would not have a good time in Africa. It's just true. So, whiteness studies try to evaluate and study that power structure to understand why it existed and how it affected things. These studies began by minority scholars who understood we gotta learn about this stuff. Because if we don't, this shit's just gonna continue and we're not gonna know why, we're not gonna be able to solve it, and we won't survive, was the basic concept. So, mainly by black scholars who understood that historicity of white superiority and understanding that getting education is key to just basic. Under critical race theory was then a new genre of scholarship, which is called critical whiteness studies. I will name one author. I think he is the only author I name in this entire lecture, and it is W.E.B. Du Bois. Major tenet for critical whiteness studies. This study took the construction of whiteness to understand its history, and then took the moral implications of that, so that we can understand how does this construction continue, why did it start, and what does that mean for minority groups? What does that mean for white people? Probably going to keep count.
Can you repeat that?
Sure, it's construction and understanding how white superiority was constructed, how it continues, the history behind it, and then what that means. So, moral implications. A lot of scholars try to blanket critical whiteness studies with critical race studies. Here's a problem with that. Yes, critical whiteness studies came out of critical race studies, but it's because they didn't think it was good enough. Critical race studies was much more on a broad understanding of just there's racial oppression, it's probably rooted in history, and the legal institutions might be able to help us solve for it. Critical whiteness studies was like, it's not just racial oppression, there's a problem. And it's not that this oppression happens and we can maybe use the legal institutions, it's that there is an overarching structure called whiteness that allows for a certain group to get more advantage. We gotta study that, figure out why they have the advantage, figure out how that happens, and then use institutions or find solutions for it. So it was more a focus on the educational aspects, at least in my opinion. Someone will get up and disagree with me, but they're not giving this lecture, so you have my biased opinion. Than it was on anything else. And it began to encourage alternative solutions to legal change. This is where you get things like grassroots movements. It's where you get things like pedagogy studies. You also get things like revolution politics, dare we say it. Other instances where we're just like, you know what's probably not going to help as much as we think it will? The white institutions that help keep white superiority afloat. Instead, we might want to find alternative routes. This is where we get things, I'll explain pedagogical studies, is alternative forms of study or education. Instead of lecturing the way the white man does, we provide, or not we, but it was focusing on allowing for study of the way different cultures educate. You'll hear black pedagogy, which was a focus on things like music, a focus on stories, a focus on narratives, stuff like that, where that type of education was seen as better. And in many ways it is. Who wants to sit here and listen to a 5-hour lecture? Oh, just put your hand down. No one wants to listen to me sit up here and lecture for 5 hours. Come on, who of you were bored when I gave part of the heads lecture? Thanks, Nancy. It's just true, like lecturing is not as educational in many ways. That's why a lot of countries, not in the US, are seen as having better education systems because they've realized this. And instead, telling stories is better because people want to listen. Singing songs is better because people want to listen and you learn better. And it's not just writing down rote memory, it's hearing rhythms, feeling education in ways that white people don't do. But then you also have things like you hear other types of pedagogy, like red pedagogy. Is anyone in here Native American? There are studies and different ways Native Americans learn. Do either of you know some ways, maybe someone has learned about this in school, of different pedagogies for Native Americans? Yeah.
I have family members there, who are Native American, like my aunt and my cousin, and they dance.
Yeah.
Dancing
That was a large focus. They also, like, the focus, if you look into Native American culture, was they didn't write stuff down. Like, it was oral learning. They told stories to their descendants, and those stories were passed down through generations. So that you had some that were awesome stories of warriors conquering, others that were stories of family, stories of kinship, brotherhood. But that education continued and lasted through generations the same way that your textbooks did. But maybe in a better way. It's a little more interesting. All right. Besides pedagogy studies, this is kind of, I'm giving you chronological order in a way. Some might be out of order, forgive me. But you get to stuff that's happening now in scholarship. I think the one thing I'll focus on is what's happening in debate, because obviously that's something you would want to learn about. And it's called anti-blackness studies. This is a response to whiteness studies. Why? Just from hearing those two words, anti-blackness and whiteness, what can you assume happened that was different between those two fields? They have different words in them, right? One says white, one says black in it. The studies came short, Christian.
I was gonna say, it's not the same, like, this system helps white people, like, helps everybody much of that.
Yeah, that's a large part of anti-blackness studies, is knowing that, and it's mainly a focus on U.S. policies, I would say. And that's something that, this is how it happens in debate, is the one author, I'll name another one, his name is Wilderson. When I was first introduced to him, I thought his name was Wilderness. Do not make that mistake. People will laugh at you. But his name's Wilderson. He is a professor, I'm pretty sure, in California. I've met him once. He's awesome, by the way. Super, super chill. And smart. Had coffee. It was great. But this study came about because we realized that, you know what we're educating people on? The oppressor. We're not educating them on who's getting oppressed. So we did this in an LD discussion where I said that points of view are important, right? Because when you have an accident, how many points of view do you want? They usually say, we have an accident. These cars crash. Forgive me that they're not car looking. And you have a person here who saw the accident. Are they going to see everything? No. They're going to see what they saw in their point of view. Usually, I'm a criminology major. They tell you how many points of view you want. You want 3, at least. 3 points of view who were in different areas. This person is going to see a lot different than what these people did. These people are going to see this car coming on and how this car came this way. This person is going to know how fast that car was going. They're not going to know that. It's a little weird of a logic for you, but why? And this is the question that people like Wilderson ask themselves. Why in the world would we want to focus on scholarship that doesn't talk about the people that are getting oppressed? Instead, it talks about the white guy who's doing the oppression and why he has that power. Instead, they said to themselves, no, doing it that way makes and neutralizes the discussion over what that oppression is, how that functions, how it lets itself come to be. So instead they said, we don't care as much about talking about the white man. We instead want to focus on the person who experiences the troubles. Anti-blackness studies, and it's very complicated. If you want to get a good knowledge of it, I can sit down and talk to you for a while. It's very confusing, I will not lie. Most of the people who write this are super smart and a million times smarter than I am. And it takes hours to sit there and read one article. So, but it's awesome. And the scholarship there is amazing. But anti-blackness studies focuses on how in the United States, there's one group out of all others that experiences oppression millions fold. Slaves. Why do you think that a slave's experience is different than a Jewish person's experience?
It lasted much longer.
Not necessarily. No, but yeah, the time frames I wouldn't say is the large distinction that is given in this literature. Although, like, it's a really good, based on the fact that I keep saying history, a good, like, try for a guess, I would say. Over here.
I believe that when I was reading Listen's explanation, he talked about the conflict in World War II with the Jews and the Army and all that as being like, he described as a family tiff, and how even though they came in conflict, they still emerged still being white and still having a kind of supremacy over black people. And how when black people were exported from Africa and into the United States.
This is where I want to focus. Go again.
They stopped being Africans, they turned into black people, they turned into slaves, and Jews stayed Jews.
Yeah. I think that's a really good highlighting of how the study worked. It says that in American policy, there's one group that their identity is different. And it's because of how that group arrived in the United States. You compare immigrants who suffer from xenophobia to slaves, their experience is different. Immigrants chose to come here. They kept their identity when they came over. But slaves were forced into a situation that they did not want. They were forced to remove certain ways of identification and culture because they were taken from their culture and put somewhere that is different and somewhere they didn't want to go. And that's kind of a large portion of the analysis, is that that struggle is different. That then identity has been different in the way that it functions in history and in politics. There's a lot more about Robertson that I'm not going to get into. It's not that simple. And that's one thing I want you to take from this lecture, is that identity is never simple. How it happens in history, how choices are made, it's never black and white. It's never even gray. It's like a rainbow of different reasons things happen, different ways oppression happens. And that's why I'm going to continue on into the next portion of social identity, which is feminism. Feminism is divided into three waves. The three waves are basically just a continuation of how the focus changed. And a lot of times you can see this of why the focus was different was because history was changing. Laws were changing. Women and groups who fought for rights and feminism realized that we had to keep trucking because issues kept arising. The first wave of feminism started in, I would say, the late 18th century. There are obviously people who thought a little quicker than others, and there are obviously some who thought a little slower than others, but that's about the time frame I'll give you. during this time, think about the late 18th century, what was going on? What had just happened, maybe? Monica?
It was post-Civil War Reconstruction era, and lots of reform movements were going on. So like there was temperance movement, and there was settlement houses, and women realized that they could get involved in civic issues and wanted to be able to vote.
A major portion of this is that women wanted to vote. Women wanted power to at least have some sort of ability to change the institutions. Xander.
Wasn't the late 18th century the 17th?
It's the 1700s.
Did I say this wrong?
You said post-Civil
Civil
War
War.
Reconstruction.
Yeah.
That
Sure.
didn't happen.
That's in,
Okay,
yep.
then I did this opposite. But
Civil War didn't
logic continues. Alright, so the basis of the first wave was just
saying, be quiet.
promoting equal contract, promoting the ability to decide who you married, which is still a problem, or at least we identify it as a problem in many cultures, which I'm going to get to later. Maybe it's not a problem. Different cultures, different strokes. But parenting, decisions on that, and decision on property rights. And by the end of the 19th century, it did end up being a focus on things like suffrage. Now, I want you to try to think of how this first wave tied with what was going on with race politics at that time.
After the Civil War, women were actually really disappointed because they were a big part of the anti-slavery movement. However, when they passed the 17th Amendment, or maybe it was like right before the 17th Amendment, specifying that African Americans could vote, they expected that women would be included in that. However, they were extremely disappointed because they weren't, and they realized that they had to branch off and form their own like separate feminist movement and not be part of that movement because they were kind of let down by it.
Sure, it's one thing I want you to know, obviously, it's not that simple. It's always complicated. And I think your example was great. Like, women saw that they were being treated kind of shitty. They wanted change that helped them. But at the same time, when they identified that it was the men causing the problem, at the same time, you could switch it back. And who do you think, when a slave was in slave times, were they just afraid of their white male master? Or were they also afraid of their white female master? It continues, and it's debated on both sides, where some say females experience more oppression, others are like, no, it's like races that experience more oppression. In the end, it's very complicated. And I want you to just realize that oppression is complicated. It has history. Understanding history will help you understand how that follows. So first wave, suffrage, property rights. We want to decide if we want to get married. We want to decide how parenting works. We don't want to be controlled by whoever we marry. But the second wave saw that there were some deeper problems that had to be solved for. The second wave saw that, you know what? Our cultural problems and our political problems have some ties. They wanted people to understand that personal lives of women were often politicized, but they were often also power structures. You heard this in Kristie's lecture. Everything comes down to what the normal or normalized version of something is. During that time, the normalized version was that it should be a white male who decides what goes on. Everyone else, just not as important. Didn't have as much rational understanding of how stuff should work. So, yeah, no, women don't know what should happen in politics. Tied to the same thing that people that aren't white don't know what has to happen in politics. They're not as educated. And that just continues on. So women realized that in order to be able to solve for their own issues, they had to leverage the political institutions. And this is what continued in the second wave, where Things that became dominant issues were the Equal Rights Amendment. Some really progressive thinkers in the second wave started to think that reproductive rights and sexuality were important things to focus on for feminism. But that wasn't where it ended, obviously. We have the final third wave of feminism, where many women felt that the second wave and first wave just didn't understand. Could the white women who led the feminist movements in the first wave, tried to lead in the second wave, understand how a black woman thought? Did they understand the problems that a minority woman experienced? No. No is the very firm answer. It's just different. In the end, this wave tried to challenge the fact that femininity was essentialized in the first and second wave. It tried to argue that overemphasizing the experiences of the upper class to middle class white woman was probably an issue that we don't want to care about as much as the fact. Oh. Kristie, yes. Yeah.
Outside. Speak with you. Go ahead.
Thanks. So during this wave, and I'll give you another name, women like Bell Hooks, who started their scholarship during the second wave, really realized the second wave couldn't solve for what they wanted to focus on. In the end, the one word I want you to write down is micropolitics, was something that became very important in the third movement. Hey, Jacob. So, I'm actually going to show you a reenactment of a speech that Sojourner Truth gave. Come on, what please? Sure.
Tell me the dates for the second two movements.
No. I could tell you maybe if you give me a little bit of time. Like you literally can look it up on Wikipedia or on Google or something else.
So do you think we're still in the midst of the third movement?
No.
I don't either.
I'm gonna argue why. There is a new movement occurring. It's called queer studies.
I also heard like feminism is not only like equality of like women, it's also like equality of like everything else.
Yeah, that is one thing that really began in the third wave, I would say, was that it's not just about woman problems. It's not just about white woman problems. It's about structures of patriarchal domination that allow for decisions in politics and culture that affect all groups of minorities, of women, of oppressed. But when we continue on, people realize that in the end it just wasn't enough, which is why you get to a new movement called queer studies, which tried to incorporate a lot of stuff.
Wasn't like one of the criticisms of like second wave that there wasn't like intersectional enough?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about with white women experiencing problems in the second wave, and then intersectionality was a focus that happened in the third wave. Started at the end of the second wave, but continued on. Intersectionality, does anyone know what an intersection is? I'll draw one for you. An intersection on a road is where you see two roads that connect. Oftentimes you'll have stop signs on all four sides. They're annoying, is the first thing, but not annoying in scholarship. Intersectionality says that, you know what? Some women don't just experience woman problems. They experience black problems. Some or class problems. And then you have some men may experience black problems, but they don't just experience black problems. They also experience oppression because they're not a straight man. And then you have some white women who experience white women problems, but also experience the fact that they're not a straight white woman problems. And it continues on because all of these intersect. I have things in my life or experiences I have that aren't just because I'm a woman. They're because I have other different identifying characteristics. I hate that word, by the way. You'll figure out why when I give my queer studies portion of this. But we realized that talking about just black oppression wasn't enough. Talking about just feminism wasn't enough. Because it doesn't understand that every person experiences oppression in a different way and in different forms because they're different. And that difference isn't bad, but we have to understand why oppression happens in different ways for different people. Alright, so are we good?
Oh yeah, we're fine.
Okay. Good, because I don't want to move. And I have 20 minutes left and I'm going to use them, goddamn.
No,
Alright.
we're fine.
So here's the video. I wish we could see Sojourner give this, but she gave it in the 1800s. So we did
No
not
video.
But I did not feel
I wonder if you
comfortable
figure out
giving it
the
for
right
obvious
actors,
reasons.
they're gonna act as if they know
I'm just not going to move it.
Well, children, where there is so much gravity, there must be something uplifting. I think between the Negroes of the South and the women of the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. That man over there says women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody helps me into carriages, or carries me over mud puddles, or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed, I have planted, I have gathered into bonds, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much, eat as much, when I can find it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of them sold into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, and none but Jesus could hear me, ain't I a woman? They talk about this thing in the head. What's that they call it? Intellect. That's it, honey. What's intellect got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quarter, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? That little man in black back there, he says women can't have the same rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where does your Christ come from? Where does your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. So if the first woman God ever made could turn the world upside down all alone, then these women, together, ought to be able to turn it right back side up again. And now that they ask him to do it, men ought to let them.
So, intersectionality and I think this is a really good speech to kind of show what it was. Sojourner Truth was a woman before her time. Is understanding that everything's connected. And that's where we get to queer theory and queer studies. A lot of third wave feminists and a lot of people who are connected to the literature realize that, you know what, as good as it's getting, it's not getting good enough. Feminist studies, a critique, did not understand how identity could be fluid. That essentializing categories is probably not something that we want to focus on. We're not just a woman. We're not just a man. We're not just straight. We're not just gay. We're not just this. We're not just that. We're a combination of everything. Intersectionality, I think, had a major influence on how queer studies came about. Queer studies, for all of you writing down feverish notes, I don't really know if this is as much a lecture or note-taking, please. I don't know, we're just having a discussion, I'm hoping. But queer studies was realizing that sexual orientation, or it was an understanding that sexual orientation and gender identity should focus on LGBTQI people and cultures. This list just keeps getting longer, so I will write it down for you on the board. Woo. Okay. So, queer studies didn't start out this long. At first, queer studies was just focusing on gender identity and sexual orientation. Understanding that feminism didn't really take into account sexual orientation, didn't take into account anything like that. But it started to evolve into a genre of scholarship that we call queer theory, which basically the things that queer theory does is that it looks at texts from both now and in history and identifies the characteristics in that text that uphold norms, things like sexual norms, identity norms, and it attempts to queer those norms. A lot of times, you might have a parent who's as big as mine is, who tries to make people offended who fit in these categories by calling them queer. So I'm going to say that for a second. But basically, queer theory uses the word queer and uses it in a good way, they would say, and uses it as a verb, which is to question, query is part of that understanding, but also just to look at the normality in this and try to make it a little abnormal. You can see how this is connected to Foucault, right? And everything that Kristie talked about with like power structures, normalization. Most queer theorists got their scholarship from Foucault. I'll give you a couple other names. Said I wouldn't, but Judith Butler was a queer theorist. If you want to know the person who is considered the founder of queer studies, it's Eve Sedgwick. You have a ton more. It's spelled like Hedgewick, but Sedgwick. So they were some main writers of this scholarship. But not only did queer theory try to queer the readings of certain texts to understand the historical implications of that literature, but it also was focused just on a theorization of queerness itself. What is it to be queer? What does that mean? Does anyone have a thought? Come on. No answer is a wrong answer, except maybe.
To be different from like set norms that society.
Yeah, I like that as a starting point, because that will really help us in what we're going to start explaining.
I think it's important to point out that fear doesn't necessarily mean someone who's entirely gay. It's just it's the feeling that sexuality or gender norms aren't set categories, but that you can exist outside them, and that's okay.
Yes. I'm glad that these answers happened right after one another, because the next thing I have in my notes is that it focuses on the differentiation in sex, but also in gender, in desire, and critiques the idea that there's stability there. Everyone's different. There's no stability in someone who considers themselves to be bi, someone who's straight, someone who's queer. That's why queer as a title exists, because there is no stability. It is all some sort of, everyone has a fluid identity. If you can get that from the queerness lecture that I'm giving, you have gotten a foundation of queer studies, is that identity is fluid. It changes, it cannot be defined, no person can be grouped into a category that is exactly the same as another individual. Javon, you have your hand up.
Yeah, like, well, how certain people describe themselves as, I guess the new term metrosexual. I don't know if that involved.
I think that that's a really good point of showing that there is fluidity. That not necessarily in a sexual sense, but in a gender sense, in a desire sense. People are always different, and you can't really place one into a certain category that's the same as another. Not only does it focus on the lack of stability in those categories, but it also challenges the institutions and categorizations themselves and how they existed. They don't just want toleration or equal status, but they want to change the way that those institutions have brought those categorizations up in the first place. And this is getting back to the history and foundations question. Ow. So, I'll give you an example. A lot of times history is connected or given an analogy, and that's building a house. There's a foundation, right? What are foundations often made of? Cement. So we have cement. My grandpa's a contractor, so he really likes when cements are stable and give a good foundation. Because then, if some sort of hurricane or something happens, and this beautiful house, thanks, get some windows, and that beautiful house is torn apart, there's still a foundation there that he can build a new house on. But if someone comes about with like one of those drill things, yeah, jackhammer.
Or if it's lousy cement.
Or if it's lousy cement or anything like that, and makes that foundation unstable, he's going to have to build it all over again. So that's the reason you really want to think about history. Because if you don't understand the historical building of certain events and how they continue to build upon categories, identity, and continue to change laws, then if you focus on this roof here, let's put a word. Does everyone know what this is? Defensive Marriage Act. If you focus on that roof and decide, oh, all the problems will be resolved if we just do this, if we just keep building on the current foundations, maybe change some shingles, put it in a different color. But if the foundation is abiding by certain categorizations, putting people in certain aspects, trying to make them achieve normality, maybe that normalization is desiring the fact that marriage is a foundation that is inherently normalized. Maybe that's not what we want to do. I don't want to change your thoughts on the subject, just giving examples. So, woohoo marriage if that's what you like. But maybe what we need to do is go a little deeper and realize the foundation is the problem. So, identity is not fixed, it cannot be categorized, it cannot be labeled. I'm going to tell you a story now. I hope it's a good one. It really pissed me off when it happened. I'm not going to name names. I was on Facebook. All stories of fights with friends start on Facebook. Let me tell you, it's just true. So, I'm on Facebook. I'm looking at one of my debaters' Facebook, where this person just goes off on multiple rants about how, and word for word, oh, this girl, she was dressed in shorts that show her butt crack, or shorts that show this. Whenever I see this, I label her. The next status, girls that wear mini skirts, I label them. And it just kept going. And I'm like, what is he doing? What are the problems that you can see in saying that you label someone? Next one was modesty. We should have it. All these girls need to learn it. What are the problems there that you see? Come on, shoot him. Because I already told him, so he knows it all. Yeah, you're labeling people. He literally said he was labeling people. And what do you think he was labeling them?
Just like when making a judgment on the quality of your music.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to express myself.
Yeah.
I think a big focus of feminism is women should dress better. Men should not look and respect women's identity.
Yeah, and that's how feminism would view it. And it continues on where I automatically thought from a queer people's point of view. Like, why are you focused on that woman when you don't know who that woman is? You don't know if she identifies, one, as a woman. You don't know, two, if she's interested in the fact that you're looking at her because she doesn't give a shit what you say. Because she's looking at the other girl over there. Maybe she doesn't dress to appeal to your male sensitivities. And it just comes down to, obviously, the straight consideration is the label of whore. You've heard it. Slut. Slut shaming is something that's talked about a lot in philosophy and literature about gender.
Also that the fact he's like focusing on like, oh, like look how like she's showing butt cracks and stuff, it's just like an example of like viewing women as like an sexual object.
Yeah. So that continues in queer theory to say that putting someone in a category that they don't necessarily belong in, because that's the normal category you want them to be in, is wrong.
Going off what you just said, I think this guy, this guy has a certain stereotype that he thinks women should act and dress, and like since this woman's outside the norm, she's gonna get those dirty words.
Yeah. I want to focus on some issues I've seen with women who aren't straight. There are two categories people try to place non-straight women in. You know the categories and what they're called.
I think there's
Butch is the first one. There's another one. Yeah, femmes. You have two categories. One is the girly female lesbian. The other is the manly female lesbian. I hate these categories. I think they're terrible. I also hate when straight guys, or any guys, or any girls are like, I can't believe she's a lesbian, she's so attractive. How many times have you heard that? Or, oh my gosh, I'm so sad that guy's gay, he's so hot. Categorization, labeling, problems. I don't really care as much if you learn the deep aspects of queer theory. I'm hoping, A, if you want to debate queer theory, this lecture or discussion is enough to get you real interested to where you do your own studies. This lecture is more of a making you see some problems. I think that's the first step to education, is highlighting a problem and then getting you interested enough to talk and think about that problem. That's a problem. This is an issue. Should be resolved. Now, queer theory does this in two different ways that I kind of highlighted, besides textual queering and categorization or theorization of queerness. It does this through deconstructionism. Queer theory is often seen as a postmodern deconstructive philosophy. There are many different ways of taking queer theory though, so don't think that I'm just putting it into one stable category. Deconstructionism questions those categories. We've kind of did a lot of deconstructing in this talk, where we questioned what these categories mean, why we should actually abide by them. The second one is subversion, which I've tried to do a little bit as well in this lecture, which is breaking down normality in sexual orders. It's a little bit along the same lines, but done in a different way, where you highlight a order. Does anyone know what that is? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You've heard that before in science.
Yes.
What is an order?
Is order like order is the third branch, right? No, that's kingdom.
Not in the science perspective,
Oh.
but what does it mean? An order. Order of the phoenix. Group. Thank you. It's the first time you've talked. So, orders are just a group. And subversion attempts to identify the normalization of that group and break it down. But honestly, in the end, what I want you to get from this part is that queerness is a reaction to stability. It says there's no such thing. And says that we should understand that categorization is something that can't understand each individual subject. You'll hear that word a lot if you look into queer theory, is the subject. So, hope you learned some stuff.
No one told me. I have an announcement.